Hello there, dear listener, and welcome back to this quiet corner of forgotten tales. Tonight, we begin a slow and gentle journey into a time long past, where hunger gnawed not only at the belly, but sometimes at the very fabric of one's soul. As you settle in and let your thoughts drift, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what hour finds you now. Feel free to share in the comments. It always brings me comfort to see how far this gentle community reaches. And if you enjoy stories told softly and with care, consider subscribing so we can continue these peaceful explorations together. But now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the modern world fall away. We are stepping into the distant past, into the dirt roads and crooked alleyways of the Middle Ages, where even the smallest crumb might carry the heaviest consequence. Picture a dim and narrow lane in a medieval town. The morning mist has yet to lift, and the cold clings to the stone walls like a second skin. Somewhere nearby, a baker has just opened his shutters, and the scent of fresh bread seeps into the air. For most, it is a simple pleasure, but for some, it is a torment. A thin boy with patched clothes and hollow cheeks watches from the shadows. His name is not remembered, but his hunger is sharp and immediate. His eyes follow a loaf as it's placed on the wooden shelf. It steams slightly in the morning chill. Without truly meaning to, his feet carry him closer. His hand darts out. The loaf is gone from the shelf. A shout rings out. This was the reality of food theft in the Middle Ages. It was rarely born from greed. More often, it came from desperation. Hunger, that quiet, relentless force, could drive even the gentlest soul to risk everything. But the punishment for such acts was far from gentle. In a world where food meant survival, and where the law was shaped as much by fear as by justice, stealing even a crust of bread could bring down the full weight of public shame and physical pain. Let us look now at what might happen to that boy. If he were caught, as so many were, he would be dragged not to a quiet back room, but into the open square. Here, in full view of his neighbors and strangers alike, he would face a punishment designed not only to correct, but to humiliate. Stocks were common, wooden frames that locked the hands and head, leaving the thief exposed to the weather and the scorn of the crowd. Passers-by might throw rotten vegetables, or worse. Children laughed. Grown men scoffed. The boy, head bowed and stomach still empty, would remain there for hours or even days. In some places, the penalty was harsher still. A first offense might earn a flogging, a second, the loss of an ear. There are records of starving men who, having stolen food more than once, found themselves branded with a hot iron, a permanent mark that warned others of their supposed moral failing. And while these punishments may seem cruel by modern standards, they were deeply rooted in the belief that order had to be maintained at any cost. In a time when communities were fragile and survival was always uncertain, theft was seen not just as a personal failure, but as a threat to the whole. What made this more heartbreaking was how often the system ignored the reasons behind the act. A mother stealing a chicken to feed her children was judged no differently than a thief who filled his pockets for profit. The law did not often ask why. It only asked what had been taken and who was to be blamed. Even those who tried to show mercy risked being seen as weak. A tavern owner who refused to press charges might be fined himself for failing to uphold the law. And yet there were those who looked beyond the letter of the law. In certain monasteries, hungry souls could find bread in exchange for a prayer. Some abbots kept aside a portion of grain to be distributed to the poor during lean seasons. But these gestures, however kind, were never enough. The hungry still walked the streets, and the scent of baking bread still led them time and again into danger. So tonight, as we begin our slow descent into the stories of food, punishment, and survival in the Middle Ages, let us not judge too quickly. Let us imagine ourselves in that boy's shoes, cold and hungry, with nothing but empty hands and the gnawing ache of an empty stomach. Let us walk those streets together and see how justice, survival, and shame could so easily become entwined. The village square was not just a place for trade and talk. It was also a place of justice, or what passed for justice in the minds of those who lived beneath the weight of the law and the church. When a person was caught stealing food, especially during the lean months of winter or drought, it was not enough for them to be punished. They had to be seen being punished. For many in power, the act of correction meant little if it was not done in full view of others. The thief became a lesson, a warning carved not into stone, but into memory. In some towns, a simple theft could end in the pillory. A wooden frame, locked around the neck and wrists, stood tall in the center of the square. The accused, often still bruised from their arrest, was placed there for hours or even a full day. The sun beat down, the cold crept in, the flies circled, and the crowd gathered. People came not only to trade goods or hear news, but to watch others suffer. There was a strange comfort in seeing someone lower than oneself, even if their only crime had been stealing a handful of dried beans. Sometimes the punishment took a more theatrical turn. In markets across England and France, a person caught stealing might be paraded through the streets with the stolen item tied around their neck. A loaf of bread, a piece of meat, or a few apples would hang from a cord, marking them as both criminal and hungry. Children followed, laughing. Neighbors whispered. For some, it was a kind of theater. For the one in the center of it all, it was something else entirely. And then there were the whippings. Public flogging was a punishment not reserved for the worst crimes. It was a tool used for many things: drunkenness, fighting, cheating, and theft. A man who took a chicken might find himself tied to a post, his shirt torn from his back, the lash singing through the air. Each strike was meant to teach a lesson, not just to him, but to everyone who watched. The pain was sharp, but the shame lasted longer. In smaller communities, everyone knew your name, and once you had been punished in this way, that name often changed. Thief, beggar, shameful. One woman, whose story comes to us from a record in 13th century York, was caught taking a wedge of cheese from a market stall. She had 3 children and no husband, her neighbors later said. The cheese was found hidden under her cloak. She was dragged to the square and flogged with willow rods. It was said she did not cry out, not even once. But for months afterward, few would speak to her. The baker refused her coin. The priest gave her only the shortest of blessings. The punishment had been done, and yet it continued in silence. Such stories were common. But what made them more than mere cruelty was how they revealed the deep fear of disorder. In a world where food was scarce and famine always a season away, anything that threatened the balance was met with force. Stealing was not just a sin, it was a crack in the wall. If one person took what they needed, others might follow. And soon the whole fragile system would collapse. So those in power did not punish to correct. They punished to protect what little they had. Punishments varied by region, by season, by mood. In the towns of Flanders, it was not unusual to see a man branded for repeat offenses. A hot iron pressed to the cheek or palm marked him for life. He could not hide what he had done. Even if he stole to feed a child, his hand would bear the memory. In Italy, some cities used iron collars, locked around the necks of thieves and worn for weeks. The weight was constant. So was the gaze of others. There were cases, too, of ears being cut. First one, then the other. A second chance was rare. A third was unheard of. A young girl in Rouen was caught 3 times. On the last, she was banished. No one knows what became of her, but her story remained, passed in whispers, a reminder of what hunger could cost. The church had its own view. Theft was a sin to be confessed and repented. But even here, mercy was not always granted. Some bishops ordered the excommunication of known thieves. To be cut off from the church was no small matter. It meant more than losing the right to attend Mass. It meant being marked in the eyes of God and man alike. For a poor soul with little else, it was a second kind of death. And yet, people still stole. They stole because their children cried, because the frost had killed the last of their cabbage, because the Lord's tithe had taken what little grain remained, because hunger has a voice that drowns out fear. They knew the risk. They felt the eyes. They saw the post. But still, they took the risk. Let us shift now from the open square to the heavy silence of stone walls. Not all punishments for food theft were public. In many towns and villages, the thief disappeared for a time behind locked doors. The local jail, often no more than a dark, damp chamber beneath the town hall or attached to a church, awaited those whose hunger had turned criminal. The space was narrow, airless, and cold. Some jails had no bedding, only straw on the floor, already damp from the last prisoner. The light came from a slit in the wall, if it came at all, and the food, bitterly ironic as it may seem, was less than what many had tried to steal. A man caught with a stolen pie or a handful of dried beans might spend days or weeks in this place. He would be fed a piece of black bread soaked in thin broth once or twice a day. If he had family, they might be allowed to pass him a scrap of cheese or a heel of old loaf. But often no one came. Time passed slowly. The body grew weak, and the shame deepened. Not all who were jailed made it out. Some died there, nameless, their offense recorded only in a scribe's careful Latin and forgotten soon after. In certain cities, jail was used not just for punishment, but as a delay. The thief would be held until trial, which might be held once a month, or even once a season. During that time, the jailer could charge a fee for food, for water, even for the straw on the ground. If the prisoner had no coin, the fee became debt, and once the sentence was served, the debt remained. Many left jail only to return, not for a new crime, but for the unpaid cost of their stay. A vicious circle drawn not in ink, but in hunger and cold. But what of those who were not jailed? There were towns where justice wore a different face. Some villages had their own customs, passed down through generations, outside the reach of royal law. A thief might be made to walk from door to door, asking forgiveness and carrying a sack of stones. Another might be tied to a tree outside the village until the morning. In rare cases, especially during times of famine, no punishment was given at all. The villagers, themselves starving, understood too well the reasons behind the theft. They let the matter pass, with nothing but a heavy glance and a shared silence. In monasteries, the approach varied. Some abbots followed the law strictly. A monk caught taking from the stores might be cast out, his robe stripped from his back. Others showed mercy. In one recorded case from a cloister near Cologne, a brother took bread meant for the guests. When caught, he confessed with tears and offered to fast for 40 days. The abbot agreed. The bread was shared anyway, and the matter was not spoken of again. In places of faith, there were still shadows of compassion. For women, the consequences could be more complex. A mother who stole was judged not just as a thief, but as a failure in her duty. She was expected to feed her children, not to steal, and so her punishment could come with harsher words or deeper shame. In some places, she was made to stand at the church door on Sunday, holding the stolen item above her head, while the parishioners filed past. Each glance was a small wound, each whisper another weight upon her shoulders. It was a slow punishment, not of the body, but of the spirit. And yet, for some, these punishments were strangely familiar. In a world where hunger never slept, and where survival often came at a cost, the risk of being caught was weighed carefully. A loaf of bread might mean a night in the jail, but it also meant a full belly for one more day. Many chose the risk again and again, quietly, carefully. Sometimes they were caught, sometimes they were not. But always hunger was close behind. There were times when even the lords and officials struggled to keep order. During times of failed harvests, when grain prices soared and the stores grew empty, food theft became common. Guards looked the other way. Shopkeepers chained their doors. And still the thefts continued. A cart of apples overturned in the street was gone in moments. A bucket of fish left too near the market's edge would vanish before the vendor returned. It was not greed, it was need, raw and simple. Records from the winter of 1316 tell of dozens arrested in a single week in a northern English town. Most were charged with taking bread, fish, or dried peas. The jail could not hold them all. Some were lashed and sent home. Others were made to pay fines they could not afford. A few simply disappeared. It is likely they died, but no one knows for certain. Their names are lost, their stories remembered only in the dust of forgotten ledgers. But their hunger, like so many others, remains part of the long shadow cast by that time. As we continue along this quiet path through history, let us consider how blurred the line could become between hunger and crime. In the minds of the powerful, law and order were to be upheld no matter the season. But for the poor, The question was not whether a law had been broken, but whether their child might sleep with a full belly. In the fields, in the markets, even at the doors of the church, this silent war between justice and need played out every day. One story from a small village in the south of France tells of a man named Etienne. He had once been a thatcher, respected and skilled, with a wife and 2 sons. But when sickness came to the village and the rains drowned the crops, his trade fell still. No one could afford repairs. The grain stores emptied early. His wife grew pale, his sons thin. Etienne went to the market, hoping to find work. Instead, he found a cart left unattended, piled with bruised apples. He took 4, just 4. The cart owner returned. Etienne was caught. At his trial, he spoke plainly. He did not cry or plead. He said only that he had taken the apples for his sons, who had not eaten in 2 days. The magistrate frowned. He told Etienne that hunger was no excuse for theft. The law was clear. Etienne was placed in the stocks for 1 full day, and the apples were returned, bruised and broken. But the story did not end there. The townsfolk had watched, and that night 3 loaves of bread appeared at Etienne's doorstep, left by someone who did not knock. This was the quiet resistance of the medieval poor. Though the law saw theft as a black and white crime, the people knew better. They lived close to the ground, close to the turning of the seasons. They knew that in winter, when the frost claimed the root vegetables and the rivers froze over, stealing a turnip might be the only way to stay alive. And so, even as punishments were handed down, small acts of kindness endured. But kindness was not always enough. In larger towns, theft was often tied to fear of unrest. Officials worried not just about food, but about what food meant. If too many went hungry, if too many began to take, the streets could become dangerous. So laws became stricter. A man caught stealing twice might be sent away, branded or whipped before a crowd. A woman caught 3 times might lose her home. In one city, a repeat offender was chained to a public fountain for 3 days, left to beg for water from the very thing he had taken. In London, during the reign of Edward the Fur, food theft was treated with particular severity. The assize of bread and ale set strict rules about pricing and quality. Those who stole bread from a baker could be punished not only by whipping or pillory, but by being barred from the market altogether. For many, that was worse than jail. Without access to the market, there was no hope of earning coin or buying food. Hunger, already close, moved in completely. Children, too, were not spared. Boys and girls as young as 7 could be punished for stealing a crust or a handful of berries. In one case, a boy of 10 was sentenced to carry a stone around the village square from sunrise to sunset. When he dropped it, he was made to begin again. His hands were raw and bleeding by the end of the day. But the magistrate declared the lesson successful. The boy, he said, would remember it always. Some monasteries recorded these stories with quiet sorrow. A scribe at an abbey in Yorkshire wrote of a woman who stole a sack of oats. When brought before the abbot, she fell to her knees. She had 6 children. Her husband had died. The oats were to be shared with her neighbors who had nothing left. The abbot gave her a warning and sent her away with bread and cheese. In the margins of the page, the scribe wrote, "Mercy is sometimes the higher law." Still, such moments were rare. Most often, the thief was punished, not because the act was evil, but because the system could not afford mercy. Every act of leniency in the eyes of officials was a crack in the wall. And yet, the people remembered. They told stories, shared glances, offered crusts to neighbors who trembled. These were not grand acts. They were quiet, almost invisible. But they mattered, and so the pattern continued. A hungry man took a chicken. A mother slipped a dried pear into her shawl. A child grabbed a heel of bread from a windowsill. Some were caught, others escaped, but all of them knew the risk. And still, they chose to feed their hunger, because in the end, survival speaks louder than fear. And in a world where law and hunger walk side by side, it was the voice of the stomach that often cried the loudest. Let us now turn our thoughts toward the estates and manors that dotted the countryside. While city walls echoed with the noise of punishment and procession, the rural world moved with quieter rhythms. But even in the fields and forests, justice waited. The manor was its own kingdom, ruled by the Lord, and his word often carried more weight than the written law. For those who lived under his roof or toiled on his land, a stolen loaf or missing chicken could become the cause of shame, suffering, or exile. Tenants, bound by duty and rent, owed grain, eggs, or poultry to their lord throughout the year. These dues were often paid in kind, delivered straight from their humble stores. When harvests were thin, it meant giving up what little remained, knowing that winter still lay ahead. Some begged for delay, some offered labor in place of food, and some, pressed beyond endurance, took back what they had once given. They stole not from strangers, but from their own barn, now under lock and key by a steward's hand. Punishment on the manor was swift and direct. The village reeve, acting under the Lord's authority, could order a beating or a day in the stocks. In more serious cases, the accused was brought before the manorial court, a gathering of locals who served as witnesses and judges. Their verdicts were guided by custom more than law. A first offense might end with a warning and a lowered head. A second brought fines or labor. A third might mean banishment. And for those with nowhere to go, exile was almost a death sentence. Records from a manor in Norfolk describe a servant girl caught with a wheel of cheese. She had taken it from the Lord's cellar, wrapped it in cloth, and hidden it beneath her skirts. When discovered, she confessed. Her hands trembled. Her voice was low. The court ordered her to return the cheese and spend 3 days sweeping the square at dawn, barefoot. But when the days were done, she was not given back her place. She was sent away. The cheese was gone. So was her home. Sometimes the lords themselves took part in the decisions. Some were harsh, using punishment as a means to assert power. Others, especially in times of famine, were more lenient. One account tells of a young man caught stealing onions from a noble garden. The Lord called for him. He expected tears. Instead, the boy stood silent, thin as a reed, his cheeks hollow. The Lord sent him away with a basket of roots and a warning. Later, he asked his steward to increase the food portion for the laborers. No records tell what became of the boy, but such mercy was rare. More often, punishment served as performance, To maintain the order of the manor, all had to see what happened when hunger crossed the line into disobedience. A woman who took flour from the communal mill might be made to carry a stone across the fields while others worked. A man who stole from the grain store might lose his right to collect firewood. These were not just punishments. They were reminders. Every act of theft challenged the fragile balance that kept the manor running. And yet, hunger paid no mind to balance. In the long winters, when the earth was hard and the stores ran low, people watched their neighbors closely. Smoke from a chimney, the scent of stew, a well-fed dog. These small things told stories. Was there enough? Was someone hiding food? Was someone taking more than their share? Sometimes the thief was never found, but suspicion lingered, heavy as frost. Folk tales from this time speak of cursed loaves, left out to catch thieves, or of spirits that protected larders from greedy hands. A woman in Bohemia was said to have left bread by the river each winter, hoping the spirits would guard her cottage. But when one year she kept the bread for herself, she woke to find all her dried apples gone. Whether by spirit or hungry hand, none could say. But such stories carried warnings, hidden in their quiet rhythm. The church continued to preach against theft. Stealing food, they said, was a sin like any other. But confessions rose sharply in spring, when Lent drew to a close. Many who had taken eggs or grain returned to the priest with bowed heads. Some were given penance. Others were told to fast, though they had already gone hungry for weeks. Forgiveness, like food, was not always easy to come by. Still, the land waited. With the coming of warmer days, fields softened and hands returned to work. Bread began to appear again on the tables, though often thinner and darker than before. For those who had stolen and been punished, the marks remained, not always on the skin, but in how they were greeted, how they were watched. Trust, once broken, was slow to return, and hunger, though eased, never truly left. Not all theft began with desperation. Sometimes it began with the slow turning of the seasons, a spring too cold, a summer too dry, a harvest too poor. The Middle Ages were not a time of plenty. Crops failed often, and when they did, hunger came not alone, but with fear, with sickness, and with change. Entire villages knew the feeling of watching grain stores dwindle and fields crack beneath the sun. And in these moments, theft was not a single act. It was a wave that spread across the land, touching rich and poor alike. In the year 1315, heavy rains soaked the fields of northern Europe for months. Grain rotted where it stood. Hay could not be dried. Roads turned to mud and carts could not pass. With the harvest lost, prices soared. Wheat became rare. Bread shrank. Families boiled weeds to fill their pots. In this time, food theft surged, not in secret, but in plain view. Men broke into mills and storehouses. Women tore open sacks of grain in the markets. Hunger does not whisper. It shouts. Records from the English royal court show a sharp rise in arrests during that year. Not just thieves, but also millers who were accused of hiding grain, bakers charged with short loaves, and merchants who raised prices beyond what most could pay. Justice, already strained, began to bend. Some judges called for mercy. Others for harsher punishment, but always the stories were the same. A turnip here, a crust there, a sack of beans taken by night and found in the morning. In one small village near Canterbury, the priest recorded his sermons with quiet dread. He wrote of children dying in the fields, of fathers caught stealing roots from neighbors, of mothers who gave away all they had. One entry tells of a man who stole onions from the chapel garden. He was caught, lashed, and made to fast for 7 days. The priest wrote, "I gave him water, but no bread. He wept." There is no record of what became of the man. Elsewhere, food theft took on new forms. In times of famine, even the nobility became cautious. Guards were posted near grain stores, locks were strengthened, but hunger slips through cracks. In one case, a servant at a noble estate removed handfuls of flour each day and hid them behind a wall. After a month, she had enough for a loaf. When discovered, she was beaten and dismissed, but some whispered that she had shared that loaf with 3 others who lived by the river. During such times, even the church wavered. Monks who had once shared their bread began to turn away the hungry. Priors locked gates. Some monasteries imposed new rules: no food to strangers, no alms without a name. And yet, in secret, some still gave. A monk in Ghent was caught passing bread through the window to a child. He was scolded, not dismissed. The abbot said, "Next time, let him come to the door." The window was sealed. The famine lasted for years in some places, and with it came sickness. Weakened by hunger, people fell to fevers, to coughs, to wounds that would not heal. Bread lines formed, fights broke out, and still the laws stood. A woman caught taking cabbage from a field was stripped of her shawl and made to walk home bare. A boy who took eggs from a hen house was locked in the cellar for 2 nights. These were not great crimes, but they were treated as such. Famine changed the rules. It blurred the lines. In some towns, theft was no longer punished at all. The jails were full. The stocks stood empty. There was no strength left for beatings. But this mercy was not lasting. As the rain stopped and crops returned, so too did the punishments. Order was restored with iron and rope. The hunger was forgotten by those who had not felt it, but not by those who had stolen, and not by those who had been caught. A young girl in Rouen once said, "The bread I took is gone, but the shame stayed. Her name is not written, but her words remain." In times of famine, people survived as best they could, some by begging, some by giving, some by taking, and all of them, in one way or another, were judged, not for what they had, but for what they needed, and how far they were willing to go to get it. The market was the heart of many medieval towns. It was a place not just of trade, but of meeting, of story, of news, and in that crowd, among the smells of fish and bread and spice, food theft was both common and feared. Sellers stood behind tables, eyes sharp. Children ran between stalls. The watchman paced slowly, hands resting on sticks. But still, hands moved where they should not. Hunger did not wait for permission. It crept forward quietly and reached without shame. Most thefts in markets were small: a handful of nuts, a fig, a dried fish, Often the thief was a child or an old man, sometimes a woman with a baby on her hip. These were not thieves by trade. They were people pulled too close to the edge. Many were caught, some were not. Those who were seen might be grabbed by the wrist, shouted at, or struck. The punishment came quickly: a slap, a pull of the ear, a call for the watchman. Then the trial, if there was one, and whatever came next. In London, the rules for markets were strict. The weights and measures were to be checked, the bread baked to standard, and the guards were told to watch for pickpockets and thieves. Yet food disappeared often. Some merchants turned a blind eye. Others set traps. In one case, a baker placed sharp pebbles in the bottom of his bread basket. When a thief reached in, he cried out. The baker caught him by the collar and dragged him to the stocks. The crowd laughed. The boy's hands bled. Elsewhere, in smaller towns, justice was more quiet. A woman caught taking berries might be made to clean the stalls at dawn. A man who took a meat pie might be told to pay double, even if he had no coin. In such cases, the punishment became debt, and the debt became labor. A cycle began: work without pay, food without fullness, hope without end. The thief was not just punished, he was used. There were also those who used the market to hide their theft. A cloak held open, a basket with a false bottom, a child taught to distract while a hand reached out. These were tricks passed along like songs, whispered in alleys and doorways. They did not always work, but sometimes they did. One merchant in York claimed he lost half his fruit each week to such tricks. He chained his stall, he paid a guard, but still the fruit vanished. Punishments for food theft in markets were often made public. The idea was simple: let others see, let them remember. A woman in Bruges was once made to wear a basket on her head, filled with the food she had tried to steal. She walked the square in silence, watched by hundreds. The basket grew heavy, the shame heavier still. When it was done, she placed the basket down and left. No one knows what became of her. Sometimes the punishment was more symbolic. A thief might be made to kiss the feet of the stall owner, or to stand with arms raised until they shook. These were acts not meant to harm, but to humiliate. They turned a moment of need into a lesson for the crowd, and the crowd, for a time, was satisfied. But not all crowds were cruel. In certain cases, those watching grew quiet. They saw not a criminal, but a neighbor, a man they knew, a girl from the next street, a mother with eyes too tired to lie. And sometimes someone would step forward, a coin offered, a word spoken, a punishment halted, not by law, but by shared understanding. Such moments were rare, but they mattered. And yet, for many, the market was a place of fear. To enter without coin was to risk more than hunger. It was to risk being seen, being judged, being marked. A man caught stealing once might never sell again. A woman accused, even falsely, might find her name whispered in every corner. Reputation was thin. Once torn, it could not be patched. And still they came, every morning with empty hands and quiet steps, hoping for work, for scraps, for mercy. Sometimes they found it, often they did not. But the hunger remained, and the stalls stood tall, bright with color. filled with food that few could touch. As the centuries passed, little changed for those who stole food. The names shifted, the towns grew, but hunger remained. It watched from corners, from empty bowls, from eyes that searched the ground for dropped crusts. In quiet villages and crowded cities, the same stories played out again and again. A hand reached, a voice shouted, a punishment followed, and yet every time the act repeated, not out of defiance, but out of need. In some places, those who had once stolen became those who now judged. A man who had been caught in his youth might, years later, sit in the court that tried another. He remembered. But memory does not always bring mercy. Some hardened, others softened. A few spoke in favor of bread given, not taken. But most followed the law. The law was simple. The law had no hunger. Parish records from the 15th century show patterns in these crimes. In winters, the thefts rose. In good harvest years, they fell, but never to zero. There was always someone left behind, an old widow with no family, a boy whose father had vanished in war, a woman turned out from service with no pay. The reasons were many. The act was the same, and the punishment, more often than not, familiar. In one account, a man was caught taking a sausage from a vendor's cart. He was not young, not strong. His hand shook. He was brought before the mayor, who asked him why. The man said nothing, only looked down. The mayor ordered him to return the sausage and spend 3 days clearing refuse from the square. But the vendor refused the food back. He burned it instead, and the smell drifted through the street. There were always those who looked on, children who watched their parents be punished, neighbors who turned away, merchants who tightened their bags. These witnesses became the next generation. Some learned fear, others learned hunger, a few learned both, and so the chain continued. Church sermons warned against theft, even while the offering box remained full. Priests told of sin and salvation, but their tables were never bare. In private, some offered food to the hungry. In public, they followed the rule. One monk wrote, "I gave bread to a thief and was told I had encouraged sin. But his belly was quiet that night. No name is given, but the bread is remembered." Among the nobility, food theft was rarely discussed. It was a matter for the lower courts, for the townsfolk, for the villagers. But even the lords were not immune. In times of unrest, their stores were raided, their carts taken, guards posted, locks added, and still food disappeared. Not always by the poor, sometimes by their own servants, sometimes by fellow nobles. Theft, it seemed, knew no rank. In stories passed by word, old women spoke of kitchens where spoons vanished, of cellars where apples slowly thinned, of chickens whose eggs were fewer than they should have been. These were not crimes, not officially, but they were known, and often forgiven, if not forgotten. A girl who took an egg might be given 2 the next day. A boy caught with cheese might be asked to stay for supper. Not everywhere, but sometimes. Hunger softened some hearts, hardened others. A man whose child had died from cold and hunger might never forgive a thief. Another might become one himself. The difference lay not in law, but in life, in what had been lost, in what had been endured. Over time, the punishments changed. The stocks were used less. The lash fell quieter. But shame remained. It followed the accused through narrow streets, past doors that did not open, a mark not on the skin, but on the name. In small towns, a thief was known for years. Even after the belly was full again, the memory lingered. And so, in silence and in story, the past folded into the present. Meals were eaten quietly. Bread was counted. Names were spoken in low voices. And all the while, the wind passed through empty barns and broken windows. It carried with it not just the chill of the season, but the memory of 1,000 stolen meals. As towns grew and trade routes thickened, rulers began to see food not only as nourishment, but as power. The regulation of bread, grain, and weight became law, and with law came inspection, punishment, and the steady hand of the crown. In England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, kings issued edicts that set the price of flour, the size of loaves, and the penalties for deceit. These laws were not just for bakers. They shaped the lives of every hungry mouth that waited near the ovens. The assize of bread, first written in England in the late 13th century, demanded fairness in every loaf. A baker who cheated the scale might be dragged through the streets with bread tied around his neck. He might be fined, jailed, or made to sell only under watch. But not only bakers were punished. Those who stole from them, even scraps, were often tried in the same courts. Theft of food, whether by merchant or by beggar, was now a matter of state concern. It was no longer just about hunger. It was about control. The records of one town near Lincoln show a man tried not for stealing a full loaf, but the crumbs that had fallen to the ground behind a cart. The judge, weary and pale, asked him what he had meant to do. The man replied, "I meant to eat them." He was sentenced to clean the baker's stall each evening for a week. The crumbs were brushed into the river. Elsewhere, in cities like Paris, the regulation of food brought both stability and fear. Inspectors walked the markets, watched the ovens, counted the bags of flour. They recorded the names of those who bought too much. They warned against hoarding. And if food was found hidden during times of scarcity, the owner might be fined or imprisoned. Even honest merchants walked lightly. Food theft changed with these rules. It became more careful, more hidden. A boy might wait outside the mill, gathering spilled grain with his hands. A woman might linger too long at the stall, hoping for distraction. Some bribed guards. Others learned when the inspectors slept. The risks were higher, but the hunger remained the same. Not all rulers were harsh. Some kings gave alms in winter. Some queens opened palace kitchens to the poor. But these acts, while noble, were not enough. The people needed daily bread, and when it was denied, they reached for it, even if the cost was pain. In Italy, during a time of famine, the city of Florence set up public ovens where grain was baked and handed to the hungry. Those who stole were still punished, but the punishment came with bread in hand. A small difference, a quiet mercy. Punishment was often theatrical. In Prague, a thief caught stealing apples from a cart was made to parade through the square, holding the apples in outstretched arms until they fell. If he dropped them, he began again. The people watched. Some laughed. Some looked away. The apples were later fed to pigs. Such rituals were common. A baker in Ghent once demanded that a thief wear a robe of stale crusts. The man walked for hours. Birds followed him. The crusts crumbled. When he reached the end of the route, only the robe's threads remained. The baker was satisfied. The thief was silent. These punishments were meant to do more than harm. They were meant to remind, to mark, to teach. But whether they worked was another question. Many returned to steal again, not because they had not learned, but because they had no other choice. The crown weighed food, and it weighed justice, but it did not always weigh mercy. That was left to the people. And the people, too, were not always kind. A merchant who was robbed too often might close his stall. A town too often struck by theft might raise walls. The hungry, caught between need and fear, stood outside those walls, waiting. And so the rules were written. The bread was counted. The crimes were judged. But the hunger that lay beneath it all remained, not written, not judged, only felt, quietly, endlessly, as one more hand reached for one more crust, hoping not to be seen. Far from fields and marketplaces, hunger took on new forms aboard ships and behind walls. When soldiers marched or ships sailed, food became a rationed treasure. Bread was hard, meat was salted, water grew foul. And in these tight quarters where every crumb was counted, the theft of food was not just a nuisance, it was betrayal. And the punishment, as always, followed. On ships, sailors were given portions based on rank. The captain received soft bread and wine. The common sailor, black biscuits and dried beans. When supplies ran low, these rations were halved, then halved again. Some stole from barrels at night. Others took from shipmates while they slept. A few bribed the cook. But when the theft was found, the sentence came swiftly. Logs from a Flemish vessel in the year 1407 tell of a sailor caught taking dried peas. He was tied to the mast for half a day with no food or water. Another, accused of taking cheese, was made to sit by the fire while the others ate, forbidden even to watch the pot. A third, who stole wine, was thrown into the cold sea and hauled back by rope. He survived. But the lesson, they said, remained. Sieges brought another kind of hunger. When a town was surrounded and supplies ran dry, food became memory. Bread was baked with sawdust, rats were hunted, leather boiled in pots. In such times, theft was everywhere. A man might steal a potato from his neighbor's plate. A guard might hide grain under his cloak. A child might take a spoonful before serving the rest. Punishment within a besieged city was brutal. To steal from stores meant death for others. A woman caught hiding carrots was dragged through the streets by rope. A boy who took meat from a soldier's pack was whipped until he could not stand. The message was simple. One theft cost many lives. Justice in siege became survival. Yet even in such times, some found pity. A record from the siege of Calais tells of a priest who caught a girl with onions under her cloak. He said nothing. He took the onions, gave her a coin, and sent her away. Later, he wrote, "Let her live. God knows what hunger feels like. In long wars, camps rose outside cities. Here, food theft was almost expected. Men took from carts, from each other, from the dead. A loaf stolen from a fallen tent was no crime to some. Others disagreed. A captain in the German lands kept a list of punishments for such acts. For bread, lashings; for meat, hard labor; for ale, a night bound to a post. The list was long. The food was short. Punishment served as discipline. In armies, order was prized. A thief was not just hungry. He was dangerous. If one stole, others might follow. The cook might guard his pot with a knife. The steward might sleep beside the flour. Some officers set examples. A man caught stealing broth was made to dig trenches alone in silence. Another was forced to eat spoiled food until he retched. These were not trials. These were warnings. Theft from nobles was treated harshest of all. A servant caught stealing from the commander's table might be branded or dismissed into the cold. Even a missing apple could end in exile. And yet the food sat there, warm and untouched. Hunger looked on from behind the curtain. In naval ports, stories spread of sailors who smuggled bread to their families. The bread, hard as stone, was hidden in clothes or tucked into boots. When found, the sailor was fined or flogged. But some officers looked away. Others shared their meals in quiet corners. Not all rules were followed. Not all hands were cruel. And so hunger crossed borders, floated on ships, walked behind siege lines, and waited in shadows. It turned friend against friend, brother against brother. And each stolen crust, each hidden root, each missing grain became more than a meal. It became a story, a sentence, a memory left behind in salt, in smoke, in silence. In smaller villages, where the streets were narrow and the fields close, justice for food theft took on a quieter shape. There were no grand courts, no rows of guards in iron. Instead, there were names and faces, and the memory of who owed whom, who gave last winter, and who had taken in the dark. These places were close, closer than the city, and in that closeness, judgment moved differently. When food went missing from a shed or from behind a stall, it was often not reported. Instead, it was spoken about, quietly, over fences, near wells, at the edge of fields. "It was a boy," someone would say. "I know whose son." A look would follow. A name passed without being said. And then, the next day, a loaf might appear on a doorstep. A hen returned. A jar of beans left near the door. No one confessed, but everyone understood. Punishment, when it came, was not always cruel. A man who stole eggs might be made to clean coops for a week. A girl who took a pie might be asked to carry water for the baker. These were not written laws. They were spoken ones, born from living close together, from knowing that the hand that stole today might be the hand that helps tomorrow. But not all villages were soft. In some places, theft was met with harshness. A boy caught with apples might be marched through the square with soot on his face. A woman who took flour might be locked in the storehouse overnight, left with only what she tried to take. These acts were less about pain and more about shame. A message written in silence and glances. Still, there were limits. In one case, a man who repeatedly took food was tied to the stocks with bread tied around his neck. The bread was pecked by birds as he stood. Children watched. Some laughed. Some turned away. The next morning he was gone, his house empty, his name never spoken again. There were also moments of quiet mercy. An old widow caught with a sack of beans was brought before the village headman. He looked at her, then at the sack. Then he gave her a coin and said, "Next time, ask." No record remains of whether she did, but the sack was not returned, and no one complained. In these places, hunger was known, not as an idea, but as a memory. People remembered the bad harvests, the long winters, the empty barrels. They knew that theft was not always wickedness. Sometimes it was just the last choice left. And in that knowing, there was sometimes forgiveness. But gossip was a punishment of its own. A girl known to steal might find her path blocked, her basket left empty. A man who took too much might find no one to share meat with him at feast. These were not laws, but they held power. A name stained in whispers was hard to clean. In one village, an old man named Peter was caught taking onions from a garden. He was not beaten, not jailed. But from that day on, people passed his house in silence. He ate alone. He spoke less. The onions grew back. The shame did not. Still, some dared. A boy named Arna once took milk from a doorstep every morning for a week. When caught, he wept. He said his sister was sick. The woman who owned the milk said nothing. She poured him a cup. The next day, she poured two. The story spread. Some called it weakness. Others called it right. Village justice was not written in books. It was carved in habit, in glances, in quiet choices. A loaf taken might be forgiven if the fields were poor. A pie stolen might be punished if the family was known to have plenty. Fairness was not always equal, but it was shaped by place, by people, by what was remembered. And as seasons turned and names faded, the stories remained, told in kitchens, at fires, near bread ovens. They were not about crime. They were about hunger, and the choices made when the cupboard was bare and the wind was cold. Within the quiet stone walls of monasteries where prayers echoed and candles burned low, food theft took on another form. The monks were fed, but not richly. Their meals were simple: bread, cheese, small fish, boiled roots. Yet to the hungry outside, even this plain fare seemed grand. And so the kitchens of abbeys became quiet targets, not just for the poor beyond the gate, but sometimes for the brothers within. There were rules, written, spoken, carved in the wooden beams. Food was to be shared according to need, not want. Gluttony was a sin, greed a fault. But when the sun set and the corridors grew still, footsteps sometimes moved toward the storerooms. A wheel of cheese with a slice missing, a sack of oats, lighter than it should have been. Not all monks resisted the taste of forbidden bread. Records from a Benedictine monastery in 1384 mention a novice who took dried apples from the kitchen. He was found by the porter, sitting alone in the herb garden, chewing slowly. He did not run. He did not lie. He said only, "I missed sweetness." The punishment was silence, a week without speaking, a week without answers. It was enough. In other places, theft brought harsher judgment. A monk in Cologne was caught with salted meat hidden beneath his robes. The abbot ordered him to fast for 10 days. On the third day, the monk collapsed. He was forgiven, but he was never again trusted with the key to the pantry. From outside, the monastery looked full of grain, of salted fish, of root vegetables stacked neatly in cool rooms. The poor knew this. They waited near the gates. They knocked quietly. Sometimes they received bread. Sometimes only prayer. And sometimes, when the gatekeeper turned, a hand reached in and took what was needed. Punishments varied. A thief from the village who was caught by the brothers might be handed over to local law, or, if the crime was small, asked to work in the garden or clean the cloisters. Mercy was more common here than elsewhere. The monks, after all, spoke often of compassion, but compassion had limits. In one story, a child was found behind the abbey wall, clutching onions in a cloth. The cook raised a ladle to strike, but the prior stopped him. He knelt before the boy and asked, "Do you know what sin is?" The boy shook his head. The onions were kept. The boy was fed. Yet not all stories ended so gently. A woman who entered a convent kitchen during a storm and took bread for her children was caught and beaten. She was made to kneel in the nave during Vespers, holding the empty breadcloth. The congregation watched. The rain dripped from her cloak. The cloth never left her hands. There were also rumors of secret generosity, of monks who left food by the outer wall at dusk, of nuns who folded cheese into folded cloth and passed it to those waiting by the chapel door. These acts were not spoken of, but they were known and remembered in quiet thanks, in whispered blessings. The line between theft and charity was thin. A hand that gave today might be the same hand that punished tomorrow. It depended on the hour, on who saw, on what was taken, and on who was hungry. Kitchens were sacred places, fires always burning, pots always bubbling, and temptation, like the scent of stew, filled the air. Even those who lived in prayer felt its pull, the warmth, the fullness, the need to feel something soft between the teeth when the world outside was cold and gray. And so the monastery remained both refuge and risk, a place of bread and judgment, a place where hunger met silence, and where the story of one stolen pear might echo longer than 100 prayers said in the dark. In larger towns where people walked shoulder to shoulder and the market stretched for streets, food theft was met with cold routine. The city watch patrolled with staves in hand, wearing leather caps and iron buckles. They did not ask why a loaf was taken. They asked only who took it. Their orders were clear: keep order, guard goods, write names. The rest did not matter. Bakers in these towns posted signs with the cost of bread written in chalk. The price rose and fell with the weight of grain and the whisper of rumors. When the cost rose too high, even those with work went without. The bread stood behind wooden counters, safe, but hands still reached for it. Most thieves in the city were not strangers. They were neighbors, apprentices, servants, young boys without fathers, women whose wages had not come. Their faces were known. That did not save them. The law was sharp. Theft was theft, no matter how stale the crust. Punishment began at the point of arrest. A thief might be struck in the street, dragged by the wrist, pushed to the ground. The crowd rarely helped. Some watched, some turned away. A few shouted, but the watch moved fast. The goal was not kindness, The goal was speed. Trials were held in corners of the city hall, beneath stone arches where light barely touched. The judge did not ask much. The record was read, the witness named, the sentence given. For a stolen apple, 2 days in the stocks. For a loaf, 5. For repeat offenses, a mark was burned on the hand, the shape of a small tea thief. The stocks stood in the square, made of thick oak, worn smooth by years of use. The thief's hands and head were placed through the holes, locked and left, for hours, for days, rain or sun. Some laughed, some threw things, others passed in silence. The thief waited, and the lesson was learned, or not. There were other punishments. A boy might be whipped behind the bakery and told never to return. A girl might be made to sweep the steps of the merchant hall, her name spoken aloud as she worked. The punishment was not always in the pain. Often it was in the knowing that the city had seen, that it remembered. Shopkeepers kept records, not always written, but remembered. A woman once caught would find fewer doors open. A man with a branded hand might be refused coin or lodging. The city was wide, but its memory was tight. Some thieves became clever. A boy tied small bells to his belt, claiming he was sent to warn rats from bread. He stole anyway. Another hid crusts in hollow shoes. A third posed as a blind beggar, lifting fruit while whispering prayers. These tricks lasted until they did not. There were guards who turned away, who saw a girl take cheese and said nothing, who let a boy run, but they were few. The law was heavy, and kindness could be questioned. A guard who failed to act might be fined or dismissed, so most watched and followed orders. Some city dwellers tried to help. A candle seller once placed stale bread outside her shop each night. She never said it was for the hungry. She never said it was not. It vanished each time, quietly, without thanks. That was enough. Yet the hunger never vanished. It lingered in alleys, in courtyards, in cold hands pressed to empty stomachs. It was not loud. It did not cry, but it watched and waited and reached again when no one looked. As trade routes thickened and coins changed hands more often than bread, food theft moved deeper into the folds of markets and supply lines, hidden not by darkness, but by the noise and weight of commerce. In these places, where grain passed through countless fingers before reaching its final bowl, the lines between hunger and profit blurred in the dust of sacks and the echo of tallying voices. Merchants who traveled with wagons full of flour and barley learned to watch their goods not only for weather and thieves in the forest, but also for hands within their own ranks. A missing handful here, a dented barrel there. The numbers rarely lied, though the mouths did. Some drivers skimmed their share, convinced no one would miss it, while others traded food for favors or gave small portions to strangers along the roadside in exchange for silence or shelter. Theft, in such circles, was not an act of desperation alone, but a pattern woven into movement, into uncertainty, into the long hours between towns, and the uncertain honesty of scale and weight. Guilds began to form laws to protect food as it passed through their gates. Ledgers became sacred. If a merchant declared 30 sacks of grain, 30 were expected, sealed, and signed upon arrival. When one went missing, the suspicion stretched across every link in the chain, from the miller's apprentice to the innkeeper's son who helped load the cart. No proof was needed, only imbalance. Punishments came not only from city officials, but from the guild itself, whose members held the power to blacklist, to fine, or to send a name whispering through the halls of trade like a warning bell before the market doors closed forever. In one account from Bruges, a man was expelled from the baker's guild for marking his bread at full weight while hollowing the center. The loss was not to the buyer alone, but to the trust of the whole system. He was not jailed. He was not whipped, but no one would sell to him again. He died years later, alone, with a small oven cold beside his bed. These were not grand stories, but they shaped the world in which hunger moved. A cracked scale could feed a family for a day. A false receipt could mean 5 fewer loaves for a village already stretched thin. And though the food still made its way from field to fire, a little less of it reached the mouths that needed it most. Along rivers where barges carried salted fish and barrels of ale, theft took another shape. Bargemen sometimes opened barrels by night, took a portion, and resealed them with care, so the goods looked untouched upon arrival. Others bribed dockhands to swap labels or hide emptier crates behind taller ones. The loss was rarely noticed at first, a subtle hunger that passed from hand to hand until it arrived as a short meal at a distant table. Justice in these cases was sharp and without spectacle. A merchant who accused a bargeman might take the case before the port council, where silence was treated as guilt and restitution was measured in coin or exile. In some ports, an offender would be made to stand with a sign hung around his neck, not for the public, but for his peers. Cheated the scale, it would say, or took what was not weighed. The shame was internal, the punishment economic, the damage lasting. And yet hunger remained present, quiet beneath the clamor. A boy watching sacks in the warehouse might steal a single scoop and tell himself no one would know. A woman cleaning the counters might pocket a crust. These were small acts, but they reflected the same truth as the grander thefts, that the world turned, but never fast enough to feed everyone. Food theft was no longer just a matter of survival. It became part of the machinery of trade, of ambition, of competition. But behind every missing portion was still a mouth, a hand, a need, and the story, as always, continued. Even in a world where food was often measured and controlled, there were days when it flowed more freely. Feast days, festivals, and market fairs brought stalls filled with pies, roasted meat, stews spiced with what little could be spared, and bread, formed not for weight, but for shape and warmth. In those moments, hunger did not vanish, but it was pushed slightly aside, replaced for a while by noise, color, and the scent of cooked onions wafting through crowded lanes. And yet, even in celebration, theft remained. Crowds moved slowly along the stalls, eyes scanning the offerings, hands close to pockets and purses, and among them walked those who came not to spend, but to take, not always in greed, often simply in need, dressed as guests, but watching for a moment when the baker turned, or the butcher shouted, or the guards laughed at a juggler. That moment, brief and unnoticed by many, was enough for a hand to close around a pastry or a dried plum and disappear into the press of people. Festival theft was not always treated harshly. Some vendors accepted it as part of the cost of doing business, especially if the thief was small, quick, and did not return. Others, however, were less forgiving. In a town near the southern coast, a man was caught taking salted fish from a market stall during the midsummer fair. He claimed he had eaten nothing in 3 days. The merchant demanded restitution. The man had no coin. He was ordered to clean the fish stands from dusk until dawn, his hands raw and red by the end of it. The fish had long been eaten. The labor remained. Elsewhere, during spring festivals, when bread was handed to children as part of ancient rites, some older boys would line up more than once, changing cloaks, bending low, mumbling new names. The bakers noticed, but rarely punished them. These were tricks of youth, not crimes of malice. Still, once a girl was caught taking more than her share and hiding rolls beneath her apron. She was not beaten nor scolded, but the bread was taken back, and she was told to wait until everyone else had eaten. She stood in the shadow of the church wall, eyes on the table, her hunger unchanged. Punishment at feasts was complicated by the presence of nobles and visitors. No one wished to cause a scene, so some thefts were handled quietly, out of view. A servant who slipped extra meat into a pouch might be dismissed without cause. A boy who took sugared almonds from the edge of a noble's tray might be warned by a whisper and a finger raised to the lips. Silence was a form of control, and fear did much of the work. Still, there were public examples. In one city square, a man who took an entire pie from a procession cart was made to sit beside the empty cart until the parade ended. He was not chained nor mocked, but he was watched by all. The cart moved past him, carrying music and laughter. He remained still, the scent of pie still clinging to his fingers. Feasts within castles told another story. There, where the kitchens stretched wide and the tables bent beneath dishes of venison and fowl, food theft came not from hunger alone, but from opportunity. Servants often tasted what they served. Some justified it as payment for their work. Others were simply tempted. A spoonful of sauce, a bite from the end of a roast, a sip from an unattended cup. These acts, while small, were noticed. When discovered, the punishment was often symbolic. A kitchen boy might be made to eat plain oats for a week while others dined on meat. A maid might be reassigned from the dining room to the stables. These shifts spoke loudly in silence. They reminded all that the food, though near, was never truly theirs. Yet there were also stories of kindness. A cook who caught a scullery girl licking honey from a spoon did not strike her, but gave her bread and told her not to steal sweetness when it could be offered. She never took again. Or perhaps she did, but never when he was watching. Feasts ended. The food was cleared, the benches swept, and hunger, which had waited at the edge of the celebration, returned quietly to its place beside the poor, the overlooked, and the persistent. Beyond the noise of cities and the closeness of village lanes stood the manor houses, large stone structures surrounded by fields not their own, but worked by others, their halls filled with warmth and meals served without coin. The Lord ate well. His family dined in comfort, and below, in kitchens and cellars and outer buildings, others moved silently between the scent of roasted meat and the distant memory of bread that never made its way beyond the main hall. In these houses, theft was not always open. It whispered. It watched. Servants knew the hours when the kitchen was empty, the trays left waiting, the butter not yet counted, a slice of cheese, a scrap of goose, a spoon dipped into a pot before it reached the long table. These moments were fleeting and filled with risk. Yet the hunger that crept through wooden floors and behind worn aprons was not easily dismissed. Records from northern estates show that food loss was often blamed on carelessness or waste rather than theft, because lords did not like to admit that their staff took from them. Still, when theft became too obvious or too frequent, someone was punished. A boy sent to fetch apples who returned with only half a basket might be given no supper. A maid whose apron smelled of broth might be questioned for hours, though no evidence was found. The house ran on appearances, and discipline, even in silence, had to be maintained. Some households kept detailed kitchen books with pages marked in precise script: 3 loaves on Monday, 2 wheels of cheese by Thursday, 10 dried fish counted and hung. These books were watched closely, and when the numbers failed to match, it was not the lord who asked questions, but the steward, a man who held both the keys and the power to open doors or close them forever. Punishment, when it came, was rarely physical. It was dismissal, quiet, without letter. A woman gone by morning, her name never spoken again. Or it was demotion, from cook's hand to latrine cleaner, from chambermaid to field worker. These changes carried shame. The bread might still be there, but the hands that once touched it now cleaned the floor beneath the table. Yet not all stories ended in retribution. In some manners, a quiet agreement was understood. The servants would eat what was left, but not what was served. And so, after the plates were cleared, bones were picked clean behind the kitchen door. Pots were scraped. Bread heels shared in corners, not in defiance, but in silent routine. No one called it theft. No one spoke of fairness. It simply was. There were exceptions. In one story from a southern manor, a child servant was caught with a boiled egg in her pocket. She had not eaten it, only hidden it. When asked why, she said it was for her mother, who lived in a hut beyond the estate wall. The steward said nothing. He took the egg. Then, later that night, he gave her 2 more. He never asked again. But kindness was not a rule. In many places, the food remained behind locked doors, watched by cooks who feared losing their position more than they feared being unkind. They shouted at those who came too close. They measured spoons before and after. And when something did go missing, the entire kitchen could be punished. The guilt spread like flour on the floor, impossible to sweep clean. In these households, food theft was a quiet rebellion. It did not aim to change the world. It did not shout. It simply filled an empty stomach where no offer had been made. And when it was discovered, the act was not described as survival, but as betrayal, not against law, but against order. Still, the hunger remained. It sat beneath the silver plates. It waited in the pantry shadows. And sometimes, when the guests laughed too loudly and the wine spilled freely, a hand moved across a tray and took something small, something warm, something that would never be noticed by those whose lives never lacked. Between towns, beyond the walls and past the far fields, there stretched long and uneven roads where travelers moved slowly, their belongings strapped to carts or backs, their feet dusty, their eyes tired. On these roads, food was not merely sustenance, it was security, warmth, and the difference between strength and collapse. It was carried in bundles, tucked into cloth, traded in whispers, and sometimes taken when no trade could be made. Travelers did not always have coin. Some carried letters of passage or wore the marks of trade guilds that gave them shelter. Others had nothing but their names and stories. Inns dotted the routes, but not all were welcoming. Many charged more than what a day's labor could earn. Some refused strangers. Some took more than money. And so the temptation to take what was not given often followed those who moved alone or too long without food. Roadside theft was not loud. It moved like the wind, quiet, uncertain, and often without witness. A loaf taken from a window ledge, a carrot pulled from a garden edge, a jug of milk emptied before dawn. These acts were rarely seen, but always felt. The owner would wake to less than expected. A hound might bark in the distance, a door might creak, but the thief, if lucky, was already gone. Punishments, when they happened, were swift. A man caught taking apples near a toll gate was tied to a post with a sign hung from his neck. Stole from the trees. He was left in the sun for half a day. No food, no water. When he was released, he walked without speaking. The apples had not been recovered. They had already passed his lips. Justice was about memory, not restitution. There were stories of travelers caught stealing from wagons, a hand reaching beneath a tarp, a crust slipped from a sack. If seen, the hand was struck. If caught, the thief might be dragged to the next village and forced to confess before strangers. Confession was a kind of cleansing, but it came with a price. Humiliation, labor, sometimes a brand on the forearm that told the next innkeeper not to trust. But the road held its own kind of mercy. Not all who stole were punished. In some cases, a wagoner would look the other way if the thief was young or thin or trembling. Bread, once taken, was rarely chased. To pursue a thief across miles of dust and stone was effort few could afford. And so, silence often filled the space where justice might have stood. In one account from a merchant's diary, a woman was found near his cart at dawn, holding a piece of dried meat. He raised his voice, reached for her, but she dropped the meat and fled into the trees. He did not follow. Instead, he wrote only that he hoped she had eaten first. That line, buried in the ink of routine, held more than judgment. It held the trace of compassion. Pilgrims, too, walked these roads, and though they often carried tokens of faith, they did not always carry food. Some relied on the charity of villages. Some fasted, not for devotion, but because there was nothing to eat. Those who stole were sometimes shielded by their cloaks and the sight of their dusty feet. A woman in one village left bread each morning at the path's edge. She never spoke of it. No one dared ask. Roadside chapels, small and weathered by time, occasionally kept stores of food for those who passed in peace. But even these were sometimes locked, and when desperation outweighed reverence, the locks were broken. In such moments, the theft was seen not as sin, but as need. And though a priest might condemn it in words, his hands often left more food the next time. The road, wide and shifting, held no court. Its punishments were uneven, its mercies quiet, its stories forgotten by most. But in the long trail of footsteps, hunger always walked just behind, patient, silent, and ready to guide the hand again, should the next door remain closed. As the seasons turned and the air thickened with frost, the matter of food shifted from struggle to survival. In winter, every loaf was counted more carefully, every dried root inspected twice, every cellar locked with iron keys that were kept close to the chest of whoever held authority in the household or the village. It was during these cold months, when the fields lay barren and the trees stood like bones against a gray sky, that food theft became both more common and more dangerous, not just for the one who took, but for all who depended on the same dwindling stores. In one village near the northern border, it was recorded that during a particularly harsh winter, 3 men were accused of stealing from the grain store maintained by the local reeve. The grain had been counted daily, the sacks tied shut, and yet weight went missing, slowly, silently. At first, the reeve blamed rats, then the wind. Finally, suspicion turned to the men whose homes stood nearest. They were questioned, then tied to posts in the village center, though none had been seen taking anything. Still, the loss needed a cause, and the punishment, once chosen, needed no reversal. Winter theft was rarely grand. No one tried to steal a barrel or a whole animal. The risk was too high. Instead, it was measured in slices, a piece of lard shaved thin and folded into cloth, a handful of beans taken from the bottom of a sack, a wedge of dried fruit cut clean and hidden in a boot. These actions were small, but they echoed. Each one reduced the village's chance of making it through the season by some fraction, and everyone knew it. Punishments in winter were harsher, not because the people grew crueler, but because fear did. A man who took food in summer could be watched, warned, forgiven. But in winter, when there was no more to give, his actions could mean death for someone else. So the lash came faster, the exile more sudden, and sometimes the judgment was quiet but sharp. A door no longer opened, a plate no longer set out, a name no longer spoken when the fire was passed around. In one recorded case, a mother was found stealing carrots from a root cellar she did not own. She was not whipped. She was not fined. Instead, the family whose food she had taken refused to share any further with her children. The theft had been for them. They still paid the price. The mother left the village weeks later, her children wrapped in shawls, walking toward a road none remembered afterward. Yet, even in this cold, there were acts of hidden mercy. A village priest, too old to farm but not too old to watch, saw a young boy sneaking into the back of the church pantry. He said nothing. Instead, he left bread in a different place the next day, then moved it again the next night, and again after that, as if inviting the boy to keep moving, keep guessing, keep surviving. Cellars were locked, but some had cracks. Some had boards loose at the corners. Some had children small enough to fit through spaces grown wide with time. These children moved quietly, listened carefully, and prayed silently that no one would notice the missing slice, the crumb, the small space where something used to sit. The hunger in winter was different from the hunger in summer. It was not impatient or loud. It did not drive people to cry out or make bargains in the street. It sat instead like a quiet weight in the ribs, behind the eyes, making the world smaller and the hands slower. And when food was taken in such a season, it was rarely about greed. It was about the next breath, the next day, the possibility of spring. And still, even when the snow began to melt and the birds returned to the edge of the fields, the memory of winter theft lingered. It sat in the spaces between words at market, in the way hands touched loaves, in the way doors opened just a little less quickly. The cold might pass, the earth might warm, but the hunger and what was done to answer it remained beneath the surface. Within the thick walls of monasteries, where chants rose before the sun and silence followed the evening bell, food was both ritual and necessity. It was measured not only in weight, but in intention. The monks did not eat for pleasure, or so they said, but for strength to continue prayer, labor, and study. Still, hunger moved among them, quietly, patiently, sometimes hidden beneath robes, sometimes carried on the breath of those who dared not speak of it. Monastic life was strict. Meals came at fixed hours, and the portions were determined by rules older than most of the men who sat to receive them. Bread was plain, cheese was rationed, wine, if permitted, was diluted, meat was rare. And when the harvest was poor or the donations thin, the servings grew smaller, and the silence around the table deepened. In such a world, the idea of theft seemed distant. The brothers had taken vows. They shared all. Yet temptation found its way into even the most disciplined corners. A monk who spent his days in the bakery might save a crust too dark for the table. A novice sent to the storeroom might leave with more than he was assigned. These were not great crimes and often not even noticed, but the rules did not bend. They only waited. When food went missing, the prior did not raise his voice. Instead, he called for confession, not public, not loud, a soft request behind a door that closed gently. If no one came forward, the matter was brought before the full chapter. The entire community would fast an extra meal, as if to remind the guilty that others bore the weight of their silence. It was not punishment of the flesh, but of the soul, and sometimes that struck deeper. There is a record of one monk, a scribe, who was seen taking an extra fig from the kitchen stores. He did not deny it. He simply said he was tired. The fig had helped him finish his copy of the Psalms. For this, he was assigned to clean the refectory floor each evening for a month, and his meals were served last. No one shamed him, but no one forgot. The monastery was not sealed from the outside world. Pilgrims arrived, merchants visited, peasants brought offerings in hope of favor or healing, and sometimes among them came those who asked not for blessings, but for bread. It was the duty of the brothers to feed the poor. A portion of food was kept aside, small but regular, and given without question. Still, not all needs were met. When the line grew long and the stores ran low, someone was always turned away. One winter, a man broke into the monastery's side storeroom, taking only what he could carry in a cloth sack: a round of cheese, a heel of bread, 2 apples. He was caught by the groundskeeper before he reached the gate. The brothers did not beat him. They did not call the guard. Instead, they made him sit and listen as the prior read aloud from the rule of the order, then gave him water and sent him away with a smaller bundle than the one he had taken. It was not mercy exactly. It was something slower, something that did not name itself. But not all acts were met with patience. In one monastery, a brother who hoarded nuts in the folds of his sleeping mat was sent away, not for theft alone, but for lying when confronted. His cell was emptied, his name removed from the ledger. He was last seen walking toward the southern woods, his robe dragging in the frost. Food in these places was sacred not because it was rare, but because it was shared. To take more was not just to steal, it was to disturb the balance, to break a circle that had held for generations. And so those who ate in silence learned to do so with care. They did not look at the extra crust. They did not reach without permission. And if they did, they knew that someone, somewhere, would feel the shift. Among the many stories carried through generations, there are those that begin not with the act itself, but with what followed. A man standing in a village square with bread tied around his neck, a child forced to watch others eat before being allowed even a crumb, a woman paraded through muddy streets holding the cheese she had taken, not to return it, but to show what she had done. These were punishments by example, crafted not just to correct, but to be remembered. When food theft was discovered, particularly in times of scarcity, the reaction depended less on the value of what was taken and more on the fear it triggered. A missing apple could mean nothing in a time of plenty. In lean months, it meant one less bite for someone else, and that fear settled deep in the hearts of those who counted each meal with careful eyes. So the punishment had to be visible. It had to speak in silence to every watching face. In a small town near the coast, a young man was caught taking dried fish from the back of a stall. He was not whipped. Instead, he was made to walk the entire marketplace at midday, holding the fish in front of him on a wooden tray, followed by a bell ringer who announced his name and what he had done. The fish, now cold and dry, was never eaten. It became a symbol, a message to others, more powerful than any fine or injury. In another case, a baker who noticed repeated disappearances from his window ledge began leaving spoiled loaves in plain view while keeping the good ones inside. When the thief returned and took the bait, he became ill, and though he survived, the village soon learned of it. The baker said nothing. He did not accuse. But no more bread went missing, and no one asked where the boy had gone during the days he was not seen. These responses were not written in law books. They were shaped by memory, by fear, by the shared knowledge that food was life and theft was not just an act against a person, but against the whole fragile balance of community. In places where authority was distant or absent, the people themselves made the rules, and often those rules were cruel not because they wished to be, but because they believed they had to be. Still, not all examples were harsh. In one parish, a woman was caught taking eggs from her neighbor's coop. Rather than punish her, the village elder brought her before the others and asked her to explain why. She said her children had not eaten for 2 days. The elder then asked the village to bring her food. They did, but they also watched her more closely after that, not in anger, but in quiet expectation. Shame, in many places, was considered more powerful than pain. A thief who was beaten might forget the pain in time. A thief who was laughed at, pointed at, ignored, that wound stayed longer. And so, in some towns, those caught stealing food were made to stand near the church door with empty bowls, not to beg, but to be seen. The bowl did not fill. The people passed by. It was not a punishment of the stomach, but of the heart. There are accounts of children who stole from street vendors, then were made to work the same stalls for weeks, not paid, but fed. This was seen as a lesson. They were given no coin, no praise, only the chance to see what was lost when something was taken. Some returned to take again. Others never did. The vendor never knew which way it would go. In all of these examples, the punishment was less about law and more about the story it created. A stolen loaf became a tale. A missing egg became a warning. And as these stories passed from mouth to mouth, from parent to child, from traveler to stranger, they grew heavier than the food ever was. In the years that followed the worst of famines and the slow return of green to the fields, people did not forget what hunger had taught them. Even as markets filled again, as bread became thicker, and the smell of stew returned to alleyways, there remained a shadow in the way hands moved toward food, in how eyes lingered on full baskets, in how carefully the last piece on a plate was regarded before being eaten. Hunger had shaped not just bodies, but thoughts, and food theft, once a daily threat, remained a memory too strong to dismiss. Villages that had once punished with rope and stocks now turned more often to warning and watchfulness. They taught their children not just not to steal, but why others might. In some places, a stolen apple no longer led to a beating, but to a quiet question, a longer look, a search for who else in the house had not eaten. Still, this gentleness was not universal. In towns where grain remained tight and winters longer than expected, the old responses returned quickly, like tools brought out from the back of a shelf. The laws never truly changed. In parchment and ink, theft remained a crime. The taking of food was still marked the same as the taking of coin or cloth. But in practice, the people knew the difference. A man who stole because his child was hungry was not spoken of in the same tone as one who took out of greed. His name was lowered in volume. His story softened at the edges. His punishment, if given, was lighter and less public, and sometimes not given at all. Old women remembered when bread was locked away behind 3 doors. Old men recalled the sound of pots scraped clean before the meal was done. These memories shaped how they judged others, how they forgave, how they tightened or loosened the string around the sack of oats. And as they aged, their memories became part of village talk, part of what was passed on without books, from hand to hand and table to table. In one valley, a stone was placed near the well, carved not with names, but with the shape of a single loaf. No one claimed to have made it. No one explained it. But those who had lived through the worst knew what it meant. A reminder, not of theft, but of the hunger that had once made theft necessary. And when strangers asked, The villagers simply said it was there so they would not forget. Some stories faded. The boy who took meat from the Lord's feast grew into a man who traded leather and was never mentioned again. The girl who reached through the fence for beans moved to another village, married a baker, and taught her children how to ask before taking. Time softened what punishment had not, and silence replaced what had once been shouted in the square. Yet even with years past, the instinct to watch food closely remained. At feasts, someone always counted the loaves. At harvest, someone always guarded the pile. And when a basket was left by a doorway, there was always a glance to see who might take from it without asking. Not from cruelty, but from memory. Memory of times when that basket might have meant the difference between standing and falling. The rules of food, shaped by hunger and survival, lived longer than laws or letters. They were etched into daily gestures, into quiet glances, into the way someone hesitated before reaching for more than one piece. They could not be erased, only softened. And so, even as the world shifted, as trade grew and roads widened, as cities rose and fields spread, the stories of food theft remained. They were told not to condemn, but to remember, not to shame, but to understand. And though the bread was now warmer and the pot more often full, the past stayed just close enough to remind each hand, each eye, each hunger, that the line between taking and surviving was never truly fixed. Good night.